The gate to my own hall had never once been closed against a stranger, yet the woman standing before it looked as if she expected it to be. She stood at the edge of my courtyard with a traveling bag clutched in both hands, her cloak damp from 3 days of road dust and worse, her chin lifted in the particular way of someone who has learned that dropping it invites cruelty. I had been crossing from the training yard when I saw her, and I stopped mid-stride because something in the set of her shoulders did not match the plainness of her clothes. She looked like a woman braced for a blow that had already landed days ago. "I am looking for work," she said, before my steward could even ask her business. "Any work. I do not need wages beyond a roof and food. I can sew, I can keep accounts, I can scrub a floor until it shines. I am not asking for charity." Her voice cracked on the last word, though her spine did not. "What is your name?" I asked. "Alira." She said it like she expected me to recognize it and turn her away for it. I did not recognize it, but I recognized the look in her eyes, the particular exhaustion of someone who has walked farther than her feet wanted to carry her, and further still from people who should have kept her close. "Come inside," I said. "You can tell me the rest once you've eaten." She hesitated at the threshold the way a person hesitates before water they aren't sure will hold their weight. Then she stepped through, and something in my chest gave a low, unfamiliar shift, like a lock turning after years of rust. I did not know yet what it meant. I only knew I did not want the door to close behind her without me on the same side of it. "My name is Darian, and I have ruled the pack lands of Dunmore since my father's death, 6 years now, with a steadiness people praise and privately find dull. I built granaries instead of monuments. I settled border disputes with patience instead of blood. My counsel has brought me daughters of allied houses more times than I can count, each one polished and pleasant and entirely unable to hold my attention past the first evening. I had begun to think I simply lacked whatever mechanism was supposed to recognize a mate. I fed my wolves, tended my land, and told myself devotion to my people was enough. Then a woman with dust on her hem and refusal in her spine stood in my gate asking for nothing but honest work, and the mechanism I thought broken turned out only to have been waiting. I sat her in the small dining hall off the kitchens, not the grand one that intimidates petitioners into silence, and had bread and stew brought before I asked her a single question about herself. She ate carefully, like someone unused to being served, and I let the silence stretch until she was ready to fill it rather than forcing her to. "My family is well regarded in Fennock Hollow," she said finally, eyes on her bowl. "My father trades in wool and dye. 3 months ago, he arranged my marriage to a merchant's son from the coast, a man twice my age, chosen because his family's ships would double my father's trade routes. I had never spoken more than 10 words to him." "You refused." "I refused." She looked up, and there was no apology in it, only a tired kind of steadiness. "I told my father I would not marry a stranger for the sake of his ledgers. He told me I was ungrateful. My mother agreed with him. My aunts, my uncles, the neighbors who had known me since I was small, all of them decided I had shamed the family by wanting a say in my own life. My father gave me until sundown to change my answer. When I hadn't, he set my bag outside the door himself. And no one in 3 months offered you shelter. Everyone in Fennock Hollow depends on my father's goodwill for something. No one wanted to be the house that took in the daughter who defied him." She said it plainly, without self-pity, the way one recites a fact of weather. "I do not regret my answer. I only regret that it cost me a home." I have heard petitioners weep over smaller injuries and demand recompense for lesser wrongs. Alira asked for nothing. She simply set the truth on the table between us and waited to see what I would do with it, as if she had already made peace with the possibility that I, too, would find a reason to close the door. "You will not sleep in the stable quarters," I said, "and you will not scrub floors for your bread, though if you want work I have a household steward who is drowning in accounts and would weep with gratitude for a second set of capable hands. You'll have a room in the east wing, meals at my table if you wish it or brought to you if you don't, and no one under my roof will ask you to explain yourself twice." She stared at me as though I had spoken in a language she needed a moment to translate. "You don't know me," she said. "I know a woman refused a stranger's ring rather than sell herself for shipping routes, then walked 3 days rather than beg forgiveness for it. I know enough." Something crossed her face then, not quite relief, because relief requires trust, and trust was clearly a coin she had learned to spend carefully. But it was the beginning of something, a loosening at the corner of her mouth that hadn't been there when she walked in. I felt that low turning in my chest again, sharper this time, like a key finding the exact groove it was cut for after years pressed uselessly against the wrong lock. I did not tell her what it meant. I barely understood it myself. I only knew that I wanted to see that loosening in her face again, and again, until it became simply how she looked. I gave her that first night to rest before asking anything more of her, and had my housekeeper, a broad, kind-eyed woman named Sella, settle her into a room in the east wing with a fire already lit against the evening chill. I did not go to see her again before morning. Whatever this feeling was that had opened in my chest like a window unlatched after a long winter, I did not trust myself to name it correctly yet, and I would not have a frightened, exhausted woman mistake my attention for another kind of arrangement, another family deciding what she owed them in exchange for a roof. Sella found me at the hearth, long after the household had gone quiet. She asked me twice if there was a debt attached to the room, she said, settling into the chair across from mine with the ease of a woman who had run my household since before I could walk unassisted. I told her the only debt in this house is the one I'm owed for keeping your boots polished, and even that I've mostly forgiven you. What else did she say? Not much. She thanked me for the fire. She asked where the door locked from. Sella's eyes were steady on mine, missing nothing, the way they never had. That's a woman who has learned to check for locks, my lord. Someone taught her that lesson hard. I did not sleep well that night, turning over what kind of household teaches a grown woman to check which side a door locks from before she checks anything else about the room. By the second morning, Alira had already found her way to the kitchens before dawn, offering to help peel roots for the day's stew rather than sit idle waiting to be told her purpose. My cook, startled at first by a guest with flour already on her sleeves, came to me by midday singing her praises, quick hands, no complaints, and a way of organizing the pantry shelves that apparently put 20 years of habit to shame. I found this did not surprise me. A woman raised to keep a merchant's accounts and run a merchant's household had more useful skill in her hands than most of the highborn daughters my counsel paraded before me, who knew how to arrange flowers and precious little else. You don't need to prove your worth to anyone here, I told her, finding her in the pantry with her sleeves rolled, and a ledger of stores balanced against one hip, tallying grain sacks with the same unhurried precision she'd bring to my treasury weeks later. I know, she did not look up from her count. I want to, there's a difference. Is there? Proving my worth to my father meant becoming smaller until I fit whatever shape he needed for his ledgers. This is different. This is just being useful because I can be, and choosing to. She finished her tally and finally met my eyes. No one has asked me what I wanted to do with my hands in a very long time. It turns out I still remember how to want things. That single sentence stayed with me longer than it should have for a man who had known her 2 days. I found myself repeating it in the quiet hours, turning it over the way one turns over a coin whose weight seems wrong, until it reveals itself to be gold, rather than the base metal it was minted to resemble. It was that same week that she first met Ash. Ash was the oldest wolf in my personal keeping, a pale gray creature with a torn ear, and a stillness to him that unsettled visitors, who did not understand that some wolves simply choose to observe rather than announce themselves. He had been my father's before mine, and in all the years since my father's death, He had approached exactly no one outside my own household with anything warmer than wary tolerance. I found Alira crouched at the edge of the kennel yard one evening, very still, one hand extended without urgency, and Ash pressed his great head into her palm, as though he had been waiting his whole life for exactly that gesture from exactly that hand. "He doesn't do that," I said, more startled than I meant to sound. He seemed lonely. She did not look up, scratching gently behind the torn ear while Ash leaned his considerable weight into her knee. "I understand lonely. I think animals can tell sometimes, when you're not pretending not to be." My father used to say Ash judged character better than any councilman he ever appointed. "Then I suppose I've passed some manner of test." She smiled down at the wolf rather than at me, but I felt the warmth of it anyway, the way I'd come to feel most things that passed through her. "What did he think of the council candidates your steward described to me, the polished daughters?" "He growled at 3 of them and hid from the rest. I took it as sound judgment." "And me? He's leaning on hard enough to bruise your knee, and I doubt you mind." "I don't," she admitted, and scratched Ash's ear once more before rising, brushing the kennel yard dust from her skirts. "I think I'd have liked a dog like this, growing up. My father considered animals an expense without a return. I always thought that said more about him than about the animals." From that evening forward, Ash took to following her through the grounds with the loyal, unhurried patience of a creature who had finally found the person he'd been waiting for. And I found myself, more than once, watching the 2 of them cross the courtyard together and feeling something in my chest ease that I had not fully realized was clenched until it wasn't. The following weeks, I told myself I was merely a fair lord looking after a woman my land had taken in. I checked on the household accounts more often than strictly necessary. I found reasons to pass through the East Wing gardens at the hour Alira liked to sit with the ledgers she'd taken over from my overwhelmed steward, her sleeves pushed back, ink smudged along the side of her hand like a badge she'd earned rather than a stain to be scrubbed out. "Your steward's numbers from last autumn don't balance," she told me one afternoon, not looking up from the page. "Someone has been skimming grain shipments for at least 2 seasons. "How do you know that and my steward doesn't?" "Because your steward trusts people. I've learned not to until they've earned it." She finally glanced up, and there was the faintest curve at her mouth, not quite a smile but its patient ancestor. "No offense to your steward." "None taken. He'll be relieved someone caught it before I had to." We found the theft together within the week, a granary clerk padding his own stores at my people's expense, and I watched Alira present the evidence to my council with a calm, unflinching clarity that made grown men who had underestimated her sit up straighter in their chairs. She did not gloat. She simply laid the truth down, the same way she'd laid her own story down before me that first night, and let it speak for itself. Afterward, walking her back toward the East Wing beneath a sky just beginning to purple toward evening, I asked the question I had been circling for days. "Do you ever think of going back to Fennock Hollow?" She was quiet long enough that I thought she might not answer. "I think of my mother's garden sometimes," she said. "Not my father, not the house, just the garden and the smell of her bread in the mornings before everything else started. But going back would mean going back to being told my life was theirs to arrange. I would rather be a stranger somewhere honest than a daughter somewhere false." "You are not a stranger here." She looked at me then, really looked, the way she hadn't allowed herself to in the weeks since her arrival, as though she'd finally decided it was safe to stop watching for the blow. "No," she said slowly, testing the word. "I suppose I'm not." The bond, when it finally announced itself in full, did not come as thunder or fire, the way the old stories claim. It came as warmth spreading along my left palm, precisely where her hand had brushed mine, passing a ledger between us, a warmth that did not fade when the contact ended, that stayed like an ember banked under ash, flaring gently whenever she was near and settling into a steady glow whenever she was simply, safely, somewhere under my roof. I had never heard another alpha describe it that way. I decided I did not need their words for it. It was mine, and it belonged to her. I did not tell her immediately. A woman who had been handed to a stranger once already, against her will, in exchange for shipping routes, did not need her new lord announcing a mystical claim on her heart within a month of taking her in. Whatever this was between us, I intended it to grow the way honest things grow, slowly, in daylight, with her consent asked at every turning rather than assumed. So I courted her the plain way instead. I asked her opinion on matters of the household and, eventually, matters of the land, and found her judgment sound enough that I began asking in counsel too, over the visible discomfort of two older lords who did not appreciate a woman's voice carrying weight. I made sure she knew the discomfort was theirs to manage, not hers to shrink from. I sat with her some evenings in the small dining hall where I'd first fed her, not because propriety required a chaperone, but because I found I did not want the day to end without a portion of it spent simply in her company, speaking of nothing urgent at all. "Your counsel doesn't like me," she said one such evening, turning her cup slowly between her hands. "My counsel didn't like the tax reform I passed last spring either. They came around." "I'm not a tax reform Darien." It was the first time she'd used my name without a title fastened to it, and I felt that ember along my palm flare bright enough that I had to set down my own cup to keep my hand steady. "No," I agreed, "you're considerably more troublesome than a tax reform. And considerably better company." That earned me a real laugh, short and surprised, as if it had escaped before she'd decided whether to allow it. I would have traded a season's harvest to hear it again. Not everyone in my household welcomed her so easily. My cousin Halric, who had spent the better part of 6 years angling to have his own daughter considered as a match for me, made his opinions known at every council session he could arrange to attend. He was careful never to say anything openly cruel. Halric was too practiced a courtier for that, but he had a gift for the kind of question that wounds while appearing only curious. "And what noble house do you hail from, Lady Alira?" he asked her once, at a supper he had invited himself to, his tone pleasant enough that a stranger might have missed the blade under it. "I confess I don't recognize the name." "None," she answered before I could speak for her, which she had made clear early on she did not want or need. "My father trades wool and dye in Fennock Hollow. I kept his accounts until I refused to be traded along with them." "How refreshingly plain," Halric said, in a tone that made plain sound like a synonym for lesser. "It must be a relief to you, finding shelter somewhere so far above your circumstances." "It has been," she said, holding his gaze without flinching. "Though I notice shelter here has come without anyone demanding I be grateful for it in the particular currency my family preferred. That's been the greater relief." I watched Halric's mouth tighten and said nothing, because she had needed nothing from me. She had answered for herself cleanly, the way she answered everything, and the silence that followed at the table belonged entirely to her. Afterward, walking the garden path alone with her, while the last of the light drained out of the sky, I offered what I could not offer at the table without diminishing her victory. "You did not need to endure that." "I've endured worse from people who were supposed to love me," she said. "A vain cousin with wounded pride is hardly a challenge by comparison." Then, quieter, "Does he speak for you, on whether I belong here?" "No one speaks for me but me," I said, "and I have never once thought you didn't belong." She studied me a moment, the same careful weighing I'd come to recognize as her deciding whether to trust a thing fully or only halfway. "Good," she said finally, "because I am done shaping myself to fit rooms I wasn't asked to fit." I sent Halric back to his own holdings within the week, with a courteous letter and an uncourteous absence of any future invitation, and did not regret it for a single day that followed. It was 2 months after her arrival that word reached Dunmore from Fennock Hollow, not a message meant for us, but gossip carried along the trade roads the way gossip always travels, faster than anything official. Elira's father, having heard that his daughter had found favor in an Alpha King's household, had begun telling anyone who'd listened that he had always known she'd land somewhere respectable, that the whole affair had been a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by young pride, that of course the family door remained open to her. Elira heard it from one of the kitchen girls, before I could decide how gently to bring it to her myself. I found her in the garden afterward, standing very still among my mother's old rose bushes, her arms wrapped around herself against a chill that wasn't really in the air. "They didn't want me until I became useful to their name again," she said, not turning around. "Nothing has changed except what I'm worth to them now." "Nothing has to change," I said. "You don't owe them an answer. You don't owe them anything at all." "I know." Her voice was steadier than I expected. I think I knew it the moment I heard. It didn't hurt the way I thought it would. It felt more like confirmation, that I was right to walk away the first time. She turned, finally, and the look on her face was not grief but something closer to a door quietly closing on its own, without needing to be slammed. "I don't want to go back, Darian. I want to stay here. Not because I have nowhere else, because this is where I've chosen to be." "Then stay," I said, and the ember in my palm burned so warm and sure that I nearly told her everything then, the bond, the recognition, the 6 years of polished daughters who had never once made that low turning happen in my chest. Instead, I only said, "For as long as you want. For always, if that's what you decide." That's a long promise for a man who's known me 2 months. I've known enough men and women in my life to recognize when someone tells the truth, even when it costs them everything. You did that the first night you stood in my gate. I don't need longer than that. She was quiet, studying me with an intensity I felt along every place the bond had marked warm. Then she stepped closer, close enough that I could see the exact moment her guardedness gave way to something braver. "Show me," she said. "Whatever it is you've been carrying since I got here. I've seen you watching me like I'm a puzzle you're trying not to solve too quickly. I'd rather know." So I told her plainly, the way she preferred truth delivered, without embellishment. I told her about the mate bond, about the warmth in my palm that had never once dimmed since her hand first brushed mine, about 6 years of a council parading candidates before a man who felt nothing, until a woman walked through his gate asking only for honest work. I told her I would not press the bond on her as an obligation, that if she wanted only shelter and independence, she would have both, unconditionally, for as long as Dunmore stood. "And if I want more than shelter?" she asked, and her hand found mine in the space between us, testing the warmth for herself. "Then I am the most fortunate man in every kingdom bordering mine," I said, "and I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain you never again stand at anyone's threshold wondering if the door will open." She did not answer with words. She answered by lacing her fingers properly through mine, the ember between our joined palms settling into something steadier than fire, something built to last through ordinary Tuesdays and long winters and every quiet, unremarkable evening still to come, which was, I had come to understand, worth infinitely more than the grand gestures the old stories always seemed so eager to describe. Between the settling of the bond and the arrival of autumn, there stretched a summer I have never once regretted living slowly. I did not rush her. I had waited 6 years for the mechanism in my chest to wake at all. I could wait a season longer for her to decide what she wanted to build with it. We fell into a rhythm that felt, looking back, like the truest courtship I could have designed if I had planned it with deliberate care rather than simply letting it happen. Mornings, she took her tea in the small dining hall, and I found reasons to linger past when my own duties called me elsewhere. Afternoons, she worked alongside my steward, whose accounts had never been tidier, and I found excuses to walk the corridor outside his office more often than any alpha king strictly needed to. Evenings belonged to us both, whether in the garden among my mother's roses or by the hearth in the small receiving room where Sella kept a fire burning even in warm weather because, she claimed, an old woman's bones needed it, though I suspected she simply liked giving us a lit room to sit in together. I taught her to ride properly that summer, since the horse she'd arrived on had been a farmer's borrowed mare, plodding and unfamiliar to her. She was a quick study, impatient with her own early clumsiness in a way I found unbearably endearing, muttering corrections to herself under her breath before I could offer them. By midsummer she could outride 2 of my younger guardsmen across the eastern fields, and did, laughing the whole way, hair loosed from its pins and streaming behind her, and I sat my own horse at the crest of the hill, simply watching her outrun every shadow that had followed her from Fennock Hollow. She taught me things in turn. How to read a ledger the way she read one, hunting not just for the numbers but for the story hiding inside them, which merchant was overextended, which harvest had been quietly worse than reported, which of my own lords was living beyond what his lands could honestly provide. Numbers don't lie, she told me once, but the people writing them do constantly, and usually to themselves first. I began bringing her into more of my governance than any alpha before me had ever brought a woman not yet his wife, and if my council grumbled about it in private, none grumbled to my face, because by midsummer even the skeptics had watched her catch 3 separate discrepancies their own scribes had missed. There were harder days too, days when something small, a phrase overheard in the market, the particular way a merchant's wife looked at her sideways, a letter from Fennock Hollow that arrived and went straight into the fire unopened, would send her quiet for an evening, retreating somewhere in herself I could not follow no matter how gently I knocked. I learned not to press on those evenings. I learned instead to simply be present, to sit near enough that she knew the door remained open without her needing to answer it that night, and to trust that she would come back to herself in her own time, which she always did, usually by morning, usually with an apology she did not owe me and that I refused every time to accept. "You don't have to apologize for needing quiet," I told her once, after one such evening had passed into a subdued but steady morning. "I know, I think I apologize out of habit more than belief now. My mother used to say a proper daughter didn't sulk, didn't brood, didn't take up more space with her feelings than the room allowed." She turned her cup in her hands, the same gesture I'd come to recognize as her working through something before she said it aloud. "I'm trying to unlearn how small I was taught to make myself." "You're allowed all the space this house holds," I said. "All of it. Every room, every hour, every mood that visits you. None of it needs to be earned first." She looked at me for a long moment, something unguarded passing behind her eyes. "I believe you," she said. "That's new, believing it instead of just wanting to." There was one evening, late in that summer, when Alira asked me directly whether I ever doubted the bond, whether an alpha king, in his private hours, ever wondered if what he felt was simply loneliness wearing the shape of destiny. "I doubted it at first," I admitted. "Not the warmth itself, that was undeniable from the first evening, but I wondered whether I was only relieved to feel anything at all, after 6 years of feeling nothing for anyone my counsel presented. I did not want to mistake relief for devotion. And now I know the difference, because I've had months to watch you when you didn't know I was watching, arguing with my steward over a column of figures, teaching Ash to fetch a stick he plainly considers beneath his dignity, sitting alone in the garden when the world felt too loud. None of that was relief. That was simply wanting to know every version of you there is to know." She was quiet a moment, turning that over the way she turned over most things before she trusted them fully. "I doubted it too," she said finally. "Not you, myself. I wondered if I was only grateful, and mistaking gratitude for something larger, because gratitude was easier to survive than hope after what my family did." And now I know gratitude doesn't make my chest ache when you're away for the day on border business. Gratitude doesn't make me save the best of every story I hear to tell you first. She reached for my hand, unhurried, certain. This is larger than gratitude, Darian. It has been for a while. I simply needed to be sure before I said it aloud. By the time the fields began turning gold at the edges, and the air carried that particular sharpness that told every wolf in Dunmore the harvest was near, I no longer needed the ember in my palm to tell me what I felt for her. I had known it plainly in daylight for weeks, not as a mystical claim laid upon her, but as the simple, settled fact of a man who had found the one person whose presence in a room reordered every other priority in it. Autumn came, and with it the harvest festival Dunmore had celebrated every year of my father's reign and mine. Lanterns were strung between the old oaks lining the main courtyard, and the scent of roasting roots and spiced cider carried from the kitchens for the better part of a week beforehand, and the whole household hummed with the particular anticipation that only a festival earned by a full season's hard work can produce. I asked Alira to stand beside me at the opening feast, not as a steward's assistant or a guest given shelter out of charity, but as the woman I intended to marry, if she would have me. I asked her privately first, in the garden among my mother's roses, because I did not want her answer performed for an audience. She said yes with her hand already resting where the ember lived brightest, as though she'd known the answer before I'd finished the question. The feast itself, when it came, was as loud and golden as any I remembered from my father's finest years. Long tables groaning under roasted game and fresh bread, my people dancing in the courtyard beneath lantern light, children weaving between the legs of grown wolves too full and content to mind them. I stood before the gathered hall with Alira's hand in mine and announced, plainly, that the woman who had walked into my gate months before asking only for honest work had agreed to become my wife, and that I considered myself the most fortunate alpha king in memory for it. The hall erupted, not the polite, obligatory cheer my council's approved matches had always drawn, but something warmer, rowdier, entirely genuine, because by then most of Dunmore had come to know her themselves, had eaten bread from her hands in the kitchens or watched her outride the guardsmen across the eastern fields or heard, in whatever version reached them, the story of how she'd refused a stranger's ring and walked 3 days rather than fold herself smaller for her father's ledgers. "They like you," I murmured to her beneath the noise as the dancing resumed around us. "They like that you like me," she said, though she was smiling in a way that told me she knew it went deeper than that by now. Or perhaps they simply like a good story. "You're not a story to them anymore. You're theirs. You have been for months, you simply hadn't noticed." The one visitor I had not expected arrived a week before the harvest festival, a coastal merchant's son named Fendrick, the very man Alira's father had once tried to bind her to, traveling through Dunmore's territory on trade business he claimed was entirely unrelated to her. I did not believe the claim for a moment, and neither, I could see, did she. He requested an audience with a politeness so smooth it had clearly been rehearsed, and I granted it only because Alira asked me to, quietly, the night before. "I would rather face him with you beside me than wonder for the rest of my life what he might have said if I'd refused to hear it," she told me, and I understood well enough to grant her that choice rather than shield her from it. Fendrick was not cruel in his manner, which surprised me. He seemed, if anything, faintly bewildered by his own circumstances. A man who had never particularly wanted the marriage either, arranged as it was by fathers with ledgers to balance, and who had come, he claimed, only to say as much. "I never asked for it any more than you did," he told her, standing in my receiving hall with his hat turned nervously in his hands. "I want you to know that. I bear you no ill will for refusing. I only wish someone had asked either of us what we wanted before it went so far as your father putting you out on the road. That would have required him to consider my wanting anything at all," Alira said, not unkindly but without softening it either. "I don't blame you, Fendrick. I never did. but I won't pretend the last 3 months didn't happen either." "No," he agreed. "I wouldn't ask you to." He glanced between the two of us then, taking in, I think, precisely what stood in the space where an arranged stranger's claim had once been meant to sit, and something like relief crossed his face, as if a debt he'd carried uneasily had just been settled without his having to pay it. "I'm glad you found somewhere honest to land," he said, and bowed, and did not overstay his welcome. When he had gone, Elira exhaled slowly, the tension leaving her shoulders in a long unwinding I felt echoed faintly through the bond, as though her relief had found a second home in my own chest. "That's the last of them, I think," she said. "The last piece of that old arrangement finally put down." "How does it feel?" "Lighter," she said, "than I expected. I thought closing that door again would hurt. It only felt like setting down something I'd been carrying without noticing how heavy it had grown." I took her hand then in the quiet hall, the ember between our palms steady as a hearth fire that had long since stopped needing to be tended. "Then let it stay down," I said. "You've carried enough doors for other people. Let this one be mine to hold open instead." The betrothal, once announced, brought its own small storm of preparations. Dressmakers summoned from 3 territories over, my council debating the proper order of ceremonies with more passion than they'd ever spent on actual matters of state, Sella taking personal charge of the guest lists with the ferocity of a woman defending a border. Elira weathered it all with the same steady patience she brought to everything, though I caught her more than once slipping away from the noise to sit alone in the garden for a quarter-hour, gathering herself before returning to the fray. "You could simply tell them to quiet down," I offered one such afternoon, finding her among the roses again. It had become, by unspoken agreement, our place, the spot where the hardest and gentlest conversations of that year all seemed to happen. I think I like watching them fuss, though. It's strange." She plucked a fallen petal from the path and turned it between her fingers. "No one fussed over anything of mine growing up. My betrothal to Fendrick was arranged over a single supper, discussed like a shipping contract, signed before I'd even properly met him. This feels like the opposite of that, like something being built carefully instead of simply decided." "It is being built carefully," I said, "by people who have come to care what happens to you. That's new for you too, I think." "It is." She looked up at me, and there was a brightness in her face that had not been there the night she'd stood dust-worn in my gate, a brightness that had been growing steadily for months the way a garden grows, not all at once, but in 100 small, unnoticed increments until one day the bare ground is simply, fully green. "I keep thinking I should feel guilty for how happy I am. As though happiness, this whole, is a debt that will come due eventually." "It isn't," I said. "I promise you that. Whatever debts you carried out of Fennec Hollow, you paid them the day you refused Fendrick's ring, and every day since has been entirely, uncomplicatedly yours." She did not answer in words. She simply leaned into me, her head against my shoulder, and we stood among my mother's roses a while longer, saying nothing, needing nothing more than the quiet fact of being together in a garden that had watched over 3 generations of my family, and now, I understood, would watch over ours as well. Word reached Fennec Hollow again, faster this time. Her father sent a letter within the fortnight, warm with congratulations, thick with the language of a man already composing how he'd describe the match to his trading partners. Elira read it once at the breakfast table, folded it without visible anger, and set it beside her plate. "Will you answer him?" I asked. Eventually, politely, briefly. She picked her spoon back up. "He can be proud of me from a distance. I don't need him closer than that anymore." I did not press her further. Some doors, once closed with real cause, are allowed to stay that way, and a woman who has finally stopped flinching at the sound of one shutting has earned the right to leave it be. Though I confess I permitted myself one small satisfaction in the matter. I had my steward draft a brief, courteous reply on Elira's behalf, thanking her father for his good wishes, and informing him plainly that his daughter had found a household that valued her for reasons entirely separate from what she could secure for anyone's trade routes. I did not sign it myself. I let it go out under her name alone, because it was her victory to claim, not mine to deliver for her. What I remember most from that autumn, more than the festival or the letter, or even the formal betrothal announced before my assembled council, is a small, unremarkable evening a few days after, when Alira found me checking the granary stores myself, out of old habit, long after the clerk's theft had been resolved, and there was no real need for me to be there at all. "You don't have to do this yourself," she said, leaning in the doorway with the particular ease she'd grown into over these months. No longer the braced posture of a woman waiting for a blow, just a woman comfortable enough in her own place to tease her king a little. Old habits. I have a few of my own. She crossed to where I stood and took the tally sheet gently from my hands, setting it aside, and I let her, because I had long since learned that whatever she wanted to say mattered more than any count of grain. I keep waiting to wake up somewhere else, back on that road, or worse, back in my father's house. It hasn't happened yet. It won't. I know that now. I think I only needed to say it aloud to believe it. She smiled, the real one, unguarded, the one I'd been slowly, patiently earning since the night she first stood dust-worn in my gate. "Thank you for opening the door." "Thank you for having the courage to knock on it," I said. She laughed at that, soft and easy, and reached past me to pull the granary door shut herself. The way she'd taken to closing up small tasks I left unfinished, as though tidying the edges of my habits had become one more quiet way of saying she intended to stay. Outside, the last of the harvest lanterns still glowed faintly along the courtyard wall, and somewhere beyond the wall, a real wolf called once into the dark and went quiet, answered by nothing, needing nothing, the night settling calm around it the way our own night had settled, finally, around us. We walked back toward the house together, unhurried, her hand still loosely in mine, and she told me, apropos of nothing, that she meant to plant winter herbs along the south wall of the garden come spring, the kind her mother used to grow, and would I mind? I told her the whole garden was hers to plant as she pleased, had been for months, and she only shook her head at me, amused, as though I still hadn't quite understood that she'd simply wanted to be asked. "I'll mind the garden," she said. "You mind the kingdom. Sella tells me that's traditionally how it's done." Sella tells everyone how everything is traditionally done. I've stopped arguing with her. "Wise man." She glanced sideways at me, the last of the lantern light catching in her eyes. "I used to think wisdom looked like my father, certain of everything, deaf to anyone who disagreed. I like your version better." "My version mostly consists of admitting when I don't know something and asking the person beside me, who usually does." "Careful," she said. "Keep talking like that and I'll start believing I'm indispensable around here." "You started being indispensable the evening you balanced my steward's books in an afternoon he'd spent 3 days failing to solve. The rest of us have simply been catching up to the fact ever since." She said nothing more to that, only tightened her fingers around mine, and we crossed the last stretch of courtyard toward the lit windows of the house together. No vow needed beyond the ordinary, steady fact of 2 people walking home in the same direction, meaning to keep doing so for the rest of their lives.